I would like to thank the Blue Waters for continuing to sponsor my PhD dissertation and allowing me to have more allocation to actually finish this project and take it to the publication level. So for today's talk, I will be discussing the motivation behind our project in terms of ocean circulation, and also discuss what prior assumptions people have made about the energy sources in the ocean and what type of questions we're trying to answer. We'll briefly discuss the two major terms, energetic terms in the ocean, so the kinetic energy and available potential energy, and why we care about the exchange between these two energy reservoirs. Then we will move on to my DNS simulation setup, discuss the surface forcing and why the Blue Waters resources allow this project to continue. Finally, I will show some results from this work. And so for this talk, I will be focused on the Southern Ocean, which is this region in the Southern Hemisphere in between Antarctica and all the other landmass continents. So if you have ever watched Inconvenient Truth, you probably are familiar with the thermohaline circulation and the discussion that we have dense water forming by when it's cooled at the poles, and all the speculation that what happens when climate change hits and all that water stops being cooled, and the idea that thermohaline circulation might get shut down. While that is true, there are a little more, that is a very simplistic view of how the ocean circulation works, and we will delve in a little more into details. So one of the things in the ocean is that it's vertically stratified. The top layer is a lot lighter than all the abyssal bottom layers, and most of the flow in general is along surfaces of constant density. The top layer in general receives much more oxygen and more light, versus the bottom layer is where more nutrients are formed from decomposition. And the important thing is really the exchange of both nutrients and oxygen between the top layer and the bottom layer. And why this is important is because it supports food webs by providing nutrients from the bottom to support life in the top layers. And in addition, also it's important because that plays a role in atmospheric carbon sequestration into the bottom layers, so it can no longer exchange with the atmosphere. There are, in general, two competing mixing models of the ocean. One is called the abyssal recipes, and it basically assumes that most of the dense water sinks primarily at the high latitudes, and then that's balanced by upwelling, so the water coming up at mid-latitudes. There's a more modern and more prevailing view today that of the idea of eddy compensation. So most of the flow follows isopycnal, so lines of constant density that get created by surface winds. And then you have transient eddies that balance this mean flow that is wind-driven. And we will talk about which of these two models my simulations support. So some of the important energetic terms in the ocean, one is kinetic energy, so that is energy generated by surface winds, and in addition it can also be generated by tides. And the second term is available potential energy, so it is generated by buoyancy or density flux when the surface is differentially heated and cooled, and also when evaporation and precipitation occurs at the surface. In addition, it could also be due to freshwater influx from ice melting or rivers, for example. But we're not really looking at coastal regions, we're looking at far away from the coast. So the important thing in the ocean is this vertical buoyancy flux, and this is the exchange between the kinetic energy and available potential energy. It is positive when a dense fluid comes up or a lighter fluid goes down, so you're creating more available potential energy. This particle is misplaced, so it has energy to go up and down. And it's negative when the opposite is true, so basically when you're putting this particle into where it's supposed to be in its density class. And here's just a brief definition of what available potential energy is. We first obtain the minimal potential energy state by resorting all the fluid parcels in order of their density. So we stack them from the densest particles on the bottom to the lightest particles at the top. And for a given density class B, we can find this parameter Z star of B. So it's height where it would be when the whole flow is resorted. So then we can define the background potential energy, which is basically a regular potential energy with the z height being replaced by z star. And then the available potential energy is the difference between total potential energy and the background potential energy. Now we're going to go and talk more about our simulation. So I start with the full Navier-Stokes equations that have Boussinesq approximation, because we're looking at very small density differences. And in addition, we have a rotation that is consistent with the southern hemisphere. I use this code called SOMAR, which is stratified ocean model with adaptive mesh refinement. So it can actually refine regions where you have high velocities. We take this domain that is rectangular. It has solid walls on the bottom, and then at the northern and southern ends, so those are the left and right BCs, boundary conditions. And then in the x direction, it is periodic to simulate that we're looking at a chunk of the Southern Ocean where the flow is consistent all across the globe. For all simulations, we impose the buoyancy condition, so higher density at the southern end, so that is where the waters are cooled, and then lighter fluids towards the mid-latitudes at the north. And then for 4 out of 5 simulations, we also impose wind stress of different magnitudes. And in general, it has a structure of easterlies in the southern part, and then westerlies in the northern part, consistent with the Southern Ocean as well. Here are some of the stress terms at the surface as compared to the ocean data. And we have 4 different types of wind stresses. So one is really small wind stress, WF1. The second wind stress is symmetric, so the easterlies and westerlies are about the same strength. The WF3 is a fit to the actual ocean data, so the westerlies are a lot stronger than the easterlies. And then WF4 is really strong wind case. So you have double what is currently in the ocean. And what we want to compare is the wind stress magnitudes and also the shape of the wind stress. So does it matter that the westerlies and easterlies are not symmetric in the ocean? And how does this tie to the blue waters? So the large-scale ocean models typically don't resolve mixing, or they don't fully resolve mixing. So the MIT GCM ECHO 2 model, for example, has 18 kilometer by 18 kilometer resolution. That's kind of a state-of-the-art model, but we have to compute the irreversible mixing as a residual from steady state. We cannot compute it directly. And even though that model has a lot of eddies and everything, as shown in this picture. In general, it is difficult for DNS models to mimic realistic ocean because it has such large aspect ratios. So it has, 10,000, 100,000 kilometers in horizontal versus only 4 kilometer depth. And it also has really large Rayleigh numbers that depend on both viscosity and the horizontal scales. So in our case, the Rayleigh number is only 10 to the 11, and that is kind of the state of the art that we can achieve currently with DNS for ocean studies, versus in the real ocean, it's something like 10 to the 20. And the computational capabilities on blue waters allow us to have a base grid that is very fine, 512 by 1024 by 128, and then also on top of that, turn on the adaptive mesh refinement. And for these particular simulations, we also need to have really long runs because we have, first of all, really small time steps. And also in addition to that, we need a lot of time steps to reach a statistical steady state that we're gonna analyze. Here's a small video of what our simulation looks like. So we start from a steady state where density is uniform, and then we continue to develop eddies as the simulation progresses. So this is the density field. Green is dense, and then purple is light. So you have a lot of transient eddies and a lot of all these turbulent conditions going on, and this is a snapshot of what the instantaneous field looks like for buoyancy, and then the bottom is a zonal average, so this is the YZ, so meridional versus depth field of the temporal and zonal average of the density field. So we have a lot of stuff going on in the instantaneous field that then gets averaged out. And one thing that I will note is that you have these sloping isopycnals in the center of the region around where y equals to 5. And that is a very characteristic thing that we observe in the Southern Ocean as well. One of the metrics that we used to analyze our simulations is this latitude-depth residual overturning circulation. And essentially what it means is that in total, so as the mean and turbulent fields get compensated, where does the flow go? So the negative cells are rotating counterclockwise, and then the positive cells rotate clockwise in this case. And what we can see is that for BF and WF1, so those are cases with either no wind stress or really small wind stress, they are largely, they're mostly due to the buoyancy driven, so that you have really dense water sinking at the north and then at the southern end, and then it rotates throughout the whole domain. Versus when we introduce greater wind stress, you have a lot more dominant red cell, so that's the wind-driven cell that we observe in the Southern Ocean. And when we compare it to what's actually happening in the ocean, so that's a schematic for the real ocean overturning circulation, you have these two cells. So you have the blue cell, which they call the lower cell in this schematic, and then the upper cell, which is both what we observe in the WF3, which is the realistic ocean scenario. However, when you have WF2, which is when the winds are about the same, the westerlies magnitude is about the same as WF3, but the easterlies are stronger because of the symmetric profile, you actually don't see this lower cell. So the dense water overflow gets shut down. And similar, when the wind stresses are too high, you also don't really see that deep WF3, that deep blue cell. So and the importance of that dense cell is that is where the carbon gets sequestrated, and that is where the oxygenation of bottom waters occurs. So we don't really want to see the shutdown of that blue cell. And finally, we also look at the terms of the energy budget. This diagram is really busy, and so the subscripts of K are the kinetic energy, and subscripts of A are available potential energy, and we also divide them in mean and turbulent components. But what we really want to focus on are the how the exchanges, so the exchanges between the kinetic energy and APE, so those terms in the long rectangular, in that long rectangle, get affected by the generation of kinetic energy, which is the green square. And so some of the terms that we look at, so the vertical buoyancy flux is the exchange between the kinetic energy and APE. And in general, we see that the mean field and the turbulent field are compensated. So that goes back to that idea of eddy compensation. So you have in the mean field, shown by the blue line in the top left graph, that is the winds generating energy in that going into the APE field. And then the eddies then take out that APE energy and put it back into the kinetic energy field that then gets dissipated. And we see some similar idea that as we increase the kinetic energy generation, the kinetic energy dissipation increases almost linearly with that. So that means that all the energy goes into the APE field, comes back into the kinetic energy field, and gets dissipated. On the other hand, in the APE reservoir, you actually don't really see much change even when you change the kinetic energy generation by a lot. So the APE field does not really get affected whether you increase or decrease the wind energy. And also, on top of that, it's not really that sensitive to the profile of the wind stress. So just to summarize my talk, first, the increase in wind stress magnitude does not significantly change the net APE energy terms. You have a balance between kinetic energy and APE conversion that is maintained through mean and eddy vertical buoyancy fluxes fields. And you don't see any significant increase in surface APE generation or dissipation. However, wind stress magnitude and shape do play a significant role in the shape of the circulation. So as the kinetic energy generation increases, you see a progression from two cell that is dominated by dense water formation at the southern end to three distinct cells that are similar to what we see in the ocean. However, when the wind forcing is too strong, for example, for that WF4 case, you see more dominant downwelling of lighter water at the northern end, and the dense water cell becomes more confined and insignificant. So what we have concluded from our work is that the current wind stress profile, so the both the asymmetry of it and the magnitude of it, is kind of the sweet spot in producing the current day ocean circulation, and the deviation of it, whether in shape profile or if the winds become stronger as is being predicted from climate change, then we're going to see a shutdown in that dense water formation cell.